Hi there, I'm Leslie with the St. Johns County Public Library System, and today I have the great honor of speaking with local author Greg Leonard, who last month had his first book published. And thank you for joining us today.
Leslie, it's my pleasure. I am certainly looking forward to sharing this story with the folks that will come to the library website and take advantage of this opportunity.
Well, thank you. Talking with you recently, as well as reading your book, and then also we have this item at the library, and this is a CD-ROM that you put together also about the history of Hastings. And I have just found your research so interesting. You know, I'm a lifelong resident of St. Johns County, and I was not familiar with the story of Hastings. So I'm thrilled that you're sharing that with us.
Thank you.
Do you want to tell us just a little bit about yourself?
Well, like you, I've spent most of my life in St. Johns County. I still reside in St. Johns County. My great-grandfather and his family came here in the 1890s and were part of the agricultural movement that led to Hastings and all of the agricultural development in St. Johns County. Prior to the 1890s, what farming existed in the county was all subsistence. It really was not any large-scale farming. Once the railroads came, that opened up the opportunity, and as you'll hear from the story, the area, Hastings and the area around Hastings became really the epicenter for a great deal of activity. So this story goes back to my early roots in the community. While I grew up in St. Augustine, there was always a family connection with Hastings. And as I watched the journey of Hastings over the years, it became obvious to me that the story of the important story about that part of St. Johns County really needed to be captured and told so that future generations could understand that there's a lot more to St. Johns County than just the St. Augustine story. There's, you know, it's, as I said to you when we met earlier, it's my opinion that every square foot of this county has an important historical story to tell. And what I'm about to share is one of those important stories. This is a painting produced by Martin Johnson Heed in the 1880s of the Great Florida Marsh. He was the first landscape painter of national renown who chose to make Florida his home. And this painting really shows you what much of Florida looks like. You would hear stories basically that the Northerners who talked about Florida would say it was a place full of alligators, snakes, and mosquitoes. It was largely swampland, except for a few elevated areas along the coast. That did not stop early pioneers from coming down, but it was very primitive. You see a pole shanty here in which this couple were living as they set up and eventually built a home. Here's another image showing a pioneer family coming to Florida in the 19th century. It's all about Calistoga wagons and horse and buggies. It's really the story of the development of transportation in Florida. It started with the steamship trade and sailing vessels. I'm showing you a picture of what was the biggest city in Florida in 1876. And I like to kind of play a guessing game typically with people. You can see the answer on this slide. I like to say, guess what the largest city in the state of Florida was in the mid-1870s. And of course, they'll think maybe it was Miami, which by the way, didn't exist then, or Tampa. It was Key West. And it was Key West because Key West was the center of the steamship trade and a major port for products shipping from the US into Central America, the Caribbean, South America, and various products that were being shipped north from those same areas into U.S. ports. So it was the largest city. Tampa only had 1,000 residents. St. Augustine was 2.5 times the size in population as of Tampa, Florida at 2,500. So it really was a different time. And the main way to get to Florida was by steamship. This map shows you that the only rail line in 1870 coming into Florida came through Fernandina Beach and went down to Cedar Key. Again, if you've traveled around Florida and you've been to Cedar Key today, it is a very sleepy, much smaller than St. Augustine community on the Gulf Coast, primarily a fishing community. But going back 150 years, it was a major port. And you can see the map showing the primary transit routes. It was all about waterways. It was either about ocean travel, or in the case of Florida, it was about the St. Johns River, which is the other location around which cities and towns developed. Jacksonville, obviously, ultimately becoming the biggest port city on the St. Johns River. But at one time, little sleepy Palatka, way down there near the south end of this map, was equal to Jacksonville as a port city on the St. Johns. This is how people traveled. This was a typical steamer. This one actually, it's the city of Jacksonville, spent 40 years as a major transportation vehicle along the St. Johns River. In 1876, he came to Florida for the first time and he arrived in Jacksonville. This is a picture of Henry Flagler from that period. Growing restless, he decided to take the family further south to St. Augustine, which even in those days was promoted as the nation's oldest city. So he got on one of those steamships, just like the city of Jacksonville, and he took it down to the what was called the Turquoise Landing. This is a picture of two steamships at the Turquoise Landing. And this is another view of that landing, what it would have looked like to the Flagler family coming off the boat and preparing to go to St. Augustine. It was a 3-hour ride in a horse-drawn rail coach like this that took the Flagler family into St. Augustine. When he arrived in St. Augustine, again, we're back in 1876, the town was a very popular destination for consumptives, for tuberculosis patients. And that's what he encountered. The accommodations were primitive. There were no good hotels. Most of the people that were there as tourists were ill. And the food that he was offered, instead of fresh food and fresh vegetables, was all canned. In 1882, Flagler was bedridden at his estate on Long Island. And he read in the newspaper about a major transaction that the state of Florida had put together with a Philadelphia-based industrialist named Hamilton Diston. Florida had basically been given title by the federal government after the Civil War to 13 million acres of swampland. And after the Civil War, Florida was in very difficult financial straits. So by the time we got to the early 1880s, they were looking for any way to raise capital. And they sold to Mr. Diston 4 million acres of Florida, of this swampland, for 25 cents an acre. Flagler viewed this major transaction. He became interested again in what he called a state that was literally giving away land in exchange for development. And he had this vision that someone with sufficient means should build a world-class hotel in St. Augustine that provided those kinds of accommodations for people that had the money to spend, but had no real way to spend that money. And that led to his dream of what became the Ponce de Leon Hotel. This is an architectural drawing of the Ponce de Leon Hotel. It was designed by the firm of Carrere and Hastings, not, by the way, the Hastings associated with the town we're about to discover. They started the hotel in 1884, and by 1887, it was completed. It was actually completed in May of 1887, but Flagler chose not to open it until January of 1888. That's when the hotel officially opened, and within an hour, more than 1,000 guests had arrived. It was a major national event, the opening of this hotel. It was perceived as the finest hotel in America at that time, superior to the Palmer House in Chicago, or any of the other fine hotels that existed in the major cities in little old St. Augustine, Florida. It was phenomenal. Well, Flagler had one other issue that was associated with fulfilling his dream for this hotel, and that was he needed fresh vegetables and fruits to provide to his guests. So he invited a cousin, Thomas Horace Hastings, who was again from the north. He was a city man, actually, and he invited him to come to St. Johns County and set up what was called a model farm in southwest St. Johns County to help meet the needs of the Ponce de Leon Hotel. And by then, other hotels he was beginning to build in Ormond Beach, in Daytona Beach, in Palm Beach, and points further south along the east coast of Florida. This is a photograph of Thomas Horace Hastings. This is the home that Thomas Horace Hastings built in Hastings. You could call it the first official house built in the community now known as Hastings. In those almost 1,600 acres, he also had several very large greenhouses where he grew strawberries and cucumbers and other crops. But he also was growing crops like rice and many other things on other acreage within the Prairie Garden facility. This is an early photograph of Hastings. And you can see all of the buildings that were beginning to pop up. This was the beginning of a boom town. Here we see an early photograph from very early in the 20th century, probably right around 1900, showing farm workers digging potatoes by hand with the community of Hastings in the background. One thing that I need to call out for you that I have not yet mentioned, we think about Flagler and his hotels, but it was not his hotel empire that opened up Florida to the rest of the world. It was the railroads that he built that allowed him to bring the resources, the people, the materials he needed to build those hotels. And eventually he built that railroad, which was called the Florida East Coast Railway, all the way from Jacksonville to Key West. And the Key West story is another famous story, very much worth researching. There's some wonderful books written about the railroad across the ocean. In the course of building his railroads in Florida, Flagler accumulated over 2 million acres of land that was given to him by the state for him to build this railroad infrastructure. And he created a company called the Model Land Company that was a major business in St. Augustine that coordinated the sale of his land. This particular ad, which, as I said, was in the Florida East Coast Home Seeker, was a magazine that they used to promote land sales. This ad was for the Wetumpka Fruit Company, one of the first large-scale farming operations in the Hastings area. This is a view of downtown Hastings in the early 20th century, sometime around 1905 to 1910. Many of the images that we were able to accumulate for this book are very high resolution, very high quality. So if you're examining images within the book, you can see incredible detail in some of these photographs. This is a gentleman named James Parkhill. He operated a business that was called the Fertile Lands Company, with offices in St. Augustine and Hastings. And like Gem City Improvement, he was selling farmland. This was part of a brochure, an 18-page brochure that was produced and went all over the country. I got this from the Smith family in Hastings because they had it, because this brochure is what brought their family a few generations ago to Hastings and to setting up a farming operation that continues today. But potatoes were not the only crop, as I implied before. Here's a picture of George Vernon Leonard and others in his orange grove. This is part of the Wetumpka Fruit Company enterprise. This is showing green oranges early on in the crop. This shows cabbage being grown at that time in St. Johns County. Cucumbers. They were first grown in those greenhouses that Thomas Horace Hastings established, but they were still being grown in the World War I era. Tomatoes, which was a relatively new commercial crop in the early days of the 20th century. Corn, of course, as high as an elephant's eye. And cattle. Cattle has always been a part of the ranch lands of Florida, actually going all the way back to the Spanish colonization period. The Spaniards set up major ranching areas in the Gainesville and Palatka areas that would cause the cattle to be brought over to St. Augustine, which is where the slaughterhouses were located during the Spanish era. But potatoes really were the main crop in Hastings by the time we got to World War I. This is a picture of potatoes being harvested and going directly from the field into what was known as a Boggs grater. Mr. Boggs was the inventor who developed this machine that you see here for grating potatoes. And the potatoes, after they'd been grated, are going directly into the barrels that would then go to the rail siding to be shipped. This is an early photograph of the wagon loads of potatoes, then packed in barrels, coming in by mule-drawn wagons, being loaded on rail cars for shipment all over the United States. This is the rail yard in potato harvest season. And it says, written on this postcard, again a postcard, it says, potato shipping yard, 60 cars per day. And it's calling out the fact that in season, 60 box cars a day would be loaded and leave Hastings for markets all over the country. Actually, some of my research said that in some years, at some times, it was as many as 100 box cars. Phenomenal amount of volume, and Hastings was just bustling. This is there at the depot with a map showing push pins that highlight the location of boxcars that had left Hastings with loads of potatoes going to markets, as you can see, concentrated in Ohio and in Illinois, but also all the way out to Seattle, Portland, Oregon, all over the United States. This is the station master, and frankly, with his home behind him, who was responsible for the railroad depot in Hastings. This is the bank as it stood in 1918. And it's an important photograph partly because this was the pinnacle of the success of the business in Hastings. In 1918, there was a shortage of potatoes nationwide, but Hastings had produced a bumper crop. So buyers flocked to the Hastings area to pay cash for potatoes, and potato barrels that might have gone for $4 or $5 in the previous year were going for $20 a barrel. The money was just coming in hand over fist into the bank, and was such a concern to the local community that community leaders patrolled the town all night long until the armored trucks could come from Jacksonville each morning to pick up the cash receipts and take them back to a more secure bank building. This is the Hastings Hotel. The bank is downstairs. It opened in 1908. It was quite the accommodations until it burned in the 1940s. This is the first major retail store. You could call it a department store. It was called the Used Building. It housed the used department store, the Oliver Plow business, the post office, and a few other businesses right there on Main Street. This is the road between St. Augustine and Palatka as it goes through Hastings. This image, also a postcard, is being shared just to give you some idea of what the roadways were like in the early era. I mean, this is not just a roadway between St. Augustine and Palatka. This is typical of all roadways in the region. There were not paved roads in St. Johns County and in most of Florida until the era just prior to World War I, 1915, 1916. And that gets us to the next part of our story. An era that is famous because of the coming of the Dixie Highway. This is a photograph of the Dixie Highway. I got it from one of our county commissioners that had this image, actually a commissioner that represents the Hastings area today. It shows I guess a Model T Ford coming down what was a brick road. And the so-called Dixie Highway was completed through St. Johns County in 1916. It was the main road essentially from Michigan to Miami. So this highway went right through downtown Hastings. And it really put Hastings on the map because it was, again, on the main road. And it was the only paved road through the county. It came from Jacksonville to St. Augustine and then went from St. Augustine to the southwest until it came to Hastings. And then it turned back to the southeast, went down to Ormond Beach, Daytona, and further on down the coast. What you see here is a parade through Hastings that happened at the opening, the grand opening of the Dixie Highway. The parade started in St. Augustine and came all the way through Hastings and went down to Ormond Beach before returning to St. Augustine. During the parade, the crowd got together in front of the Hastings Cold Storage Building, where local politicians made speeches, as local politicians like to do wherever a crowd's gathered. And they talked about what this major roadway was going to do for St. Johns County, for Hastings, for St. Augustine, and even for the state of Florida. This is the first auto repair shop in Hastings, Stone Street and Miller. And true to the era in which there was a transition from horse and buggy to automobile, they did both. It was a blacksmith shop, it was an auto repair shop. This is one of the many trains that went through Hastings each day in 1930. This was called the Potato Special. That was this locomotive's name. The Florida East Coast Railway named many of their locomotives with colorful names. 20 to 30 of these trains stopped at and went through Hastings every day. So not only was Hastings on the main highway, but it was a major stop on the railroad. This is Bob Lovett. He came to Hastings in the 1920s. First, he worked in auto repair, and then he opened the community's leading grocery store, the Lovett's Market, which was an active business in Hastings from 1926 until the mid-1980s. With Bob Lovett, as the person that everybody counted on, very high quality meats. It was even when I was a boy, very active business. The drugstore in town was Causey's. Causey's was that classic soda fountain kind of drugstore where people would sit in a booth and the kids would come after school and have a soda or a milkshake. It had those rotating stools that you could sit on and spin yourself around. And it was the place where the farm management operators, almost all of them would come every morning during the week. After they got their crews started in the field, they would all come to Elmo's and share stories and talk business. Where the women liked to go was Carlisle's. Carlisle's was a very elegant women's store that opened in Hastings in the 1920s and continued in Hastings until the 1970s. This is Rhoda Carlisle. She was a innovative retail owner in the fashion business. She literally was the precursor for a personal shopper. And the well-heeled women of the time in St. Augustine, in Palatka, and even in Jacksonville would come to sleepy little Hastings, Florida to buy the latest fashions at Miss Rhoda's store. This is an important image because it is a bit of a landmark for changing times in the Hastings area. This map shows you the original route of the Dixie Highway, what's called the Old Dixie Highway on this map. As I told you earlier, the Dixie Highway, when it came through St. Johns County in 1916, came from Jacksonville to the north side of St. Augustine, then went to the southwest, as you can see, and made this kind of triangular shape to go out to Hastings, went along the rail line there for the FEC Railway, and then curved back, went back to the southeast to Ormond Beach and further south. In 1925, the National Highway System made a decision to create a new route for the Dixie Highway from St. Augustine directly south to Daytona Beach and further south. What you see here as State Road number 4 became US Highway number 1 that still exists today. And up until the advent of Interstate 95 and the interstate highway system, US 1 was one of the most important highways along the east coast of Florida. But as you can imagine, it pulled traffic, auto traffic, away from the Hastings area and took Hastings off the main highway to the south. I was often asked when I was preparing this book what I was going to call it. And I thought about all kinds of names, but you know, it kind of became obvious because to everyone who's familiar with the area, they know that it's known as the Hastings Potato Capital. This is a picture from 1946 with our potato queen of that year standing next to the original Hastings Potato Capital sign that was created or developed by the original historians of the town of Hastings. And this wasn't just kind of a marketing name for the Hastings community. It truly was and is the agricultural area that produces the largest yield of potatoes in the state of Florida to this day. When I was putting this together, I realized that if you look at this sign, if you drive by it, if you stop, and if you read what this sign says, for every historical sign in Florida, there's a story behind that sign. And I have just shared with you the story behind that sign for Hastings. I'm showing you this document not because I am going to read it, but if there's one reason to pick up the book and read portions of it, this is a wonderful poem written in 1961 that beautifully captures what a tour of walking door to door down Main Street in Hastings was like. And you can find more if you'll pick up a copy of the book that was published in March by Arcadia Publishing. I'm very proud of the quality of the book, not frankly so much because of my effort, but because of the quality of the publishing itself. The photographs are really excellent. The resolution is excellent. The story is rich, and I've only shared part of it. So I hope you're curious enough to want to know more. And I also hope you're curious to want to learn more about other parts of St. Johns County, because it truly is a treasure. St. Augustine may be the diamond in the middle, but it's surrounded by gemstones. Now, if you are in St. Johns County, if you happen to take a drive to Hastings, there's a little restaurant in Elkton called Jim's Place that has the book. There's a restaurant that lots of people like to go to in Hastings called Norma D's that has the book. Gator Hardware in Hastings has the book, and County Line Produce. So if you're stopping and getting fresh produce to take home, they have the book. Hastings as a community, I think, is proud to share this story with as many people as possible.